So here's what I plan to cover today. Hopefully, as I say, about an hour or so. So I'm going to be quite quick, and I will be leaving some areas out. I can go into details and question and answers with some more stuff I want to. So here we go. So most of you have seen the email. A lot of you have responded to my homework question, which was what makes a regiment bad. And if you've got your lists to hand, that would be fantastic. That's the beginning. The bit in between the beginning and the end is the muddle. I'm going to be talking about the regiment that I think is particularly worthy of this title, and all the things that went wrong at the various stages. And then finally, there was a bit of redemption, and I'll just try and see if I can bring all that together in one thing. So here we go. So, sorry, two clicking. So here we go. Where did I start? How did all this come together? Well, I'll show you how it started in a few minutes, but effectively, I posed the question, what makes a regiment bad? And I had to have a source to go to, and one of the books that I looked at, or in fact, one of the few books that are available is from a lady called Ella Long in Desertions During the Civil War, and this was printed in 1928. And if you pick it up now, it's still a reasonable read, although with the benefit of hindsight, I feel there is a ton of other stuff that she could have added, which I'll try to allude to. She was, as she is on the left-hand side, a lovely looking lady, 1879 to 1962. So she was pre-centenary, so she had nothing to, she had no cross to bear, I think, about either thing. She just wrote this. And she was one of the few women writing, studying the American Civil War at that time. So hats off to her. So what did she say? And, you know, you should be ticking these things off as you go, please. So here we go. So she said, first of all, in her book, she talks about desertions from the North and the South. So effectively, she said, well, there were some people who actually had sympathies for the Southern cause in the North. That's why they deserted. Obviously, poor supplies, poor and insufficient supplies. If the army's not looking after you, you're effectively not going to be looking after the army. Okay, this is all standard stuff. I'm sure you've got this at home. If your pay was, I'm not saying poor, but if you didn't get any money, that's another reason to grumble. And we all know that money was in short supply for the North, probably virtually non-existent for the South, but that's one of the reasons she says. Lack of discipline, again, tick on your bingo card, please, for that one. Bounty jumping, she goes a lot on about bounty jumping. That comes into when the draft comes on, really. And a lot of the claims, you know, sign up, you'll get various amounts over the years. The year that I'm talking about was $160. And, you know, there was a lot of people who she claims, her evidence, her research showed that there was a lot of bounty jumping over the time, so she put that in. Doesn't affect our regiment that much. Encouragement to desert by civilians. You know, oh, you know, the crops need tilling and all this type of stuff. You know, your brother's been killed. We need you back. We need you back home. Okay, so that's what Ella Long covers in her book. Those are the main sort of areas. So I went away when I was looking at this regiment, and I sort of said to myself, well, what else could there be? And I also said, you know, can I have some help? So I've added 7 other factors, and I'm just going to run through them because I go into detail with these a bit further on. So here we go. A regiment is bad because they basically didn't want to fight. They were cowards. in front of the enemy. And that takes a, it's more of a group decision as opposed to an individual decision, I suppose. A regiment's bad because they're not doing anything. They're inactive. Some may say that's a benefit. Actually, if you don't get shot at, you don't get, you don't get hurt. The weather, well, okay, some people are going, come on, Greg, you're starting to push the boundaries here a little bit. Well, you don't want to, you can't fight at that time of the year. You couldn't fight in the winter. You couldn't fight in the rainy season. All sorts of things happen to make you not want to fight, or what makes you bad. Senior officers, we're either talking right at the very top, or indeed your regiment, brigade officers. If they're not very good, then you're not very good. And again, you should be thinking about a number of regiments that fall into this category. Some brigades have a bad reputation. Indeed, some corps. Okay, let's not dwell on Howard's corps too much, but those Germans, they weren't all that bad, were they? I don't know. Weariness, you're worn out. Remember, these are volunteers. Not every man was fighting fit when they entered the service, and certainly, a lot of marching, a lot of picket duty, all that type of thing will cause weariness, lack of sleep, all that type of thing. Loss of comrades. If you see, your friends going down, then, it's not good for morale. Okay. I would also, let's go back a stage. Loss of comrades also includes sickness in this particular area, although I didn't make it too clear when I first did it. And finally, the politics of the time, particularly with this regiment that I'm looking at, it's going to be the old story of, we're fighting. Are we fighting for the Union? Are we fighting for abolition? Are we fighting for our party? What are we actually fighting for all the time? So if you compare the two lists, and again, my right-hand list is not as extensive because you've also made a contribution, which I'll just go on to a second. Ella Lon, she doesn't mention sickness hardly in her book, and I think that sickness is quite a major factor in how the war was conducted as we go through. Now, I set you some homework, and I'm very pleased that a lot of you, replied. Some just did 3 or 4 lines, basically the stuff that you've got there in front of you. Some did a little bit more, which I'm very, very pleased with, and you'll get a gold star. But some people sent their homework in late. I received at 12 o'clock today a submission from one of you. I wasn't happy, Eric. Okay, so let's see what people said. So I'm not going to read through all this really, because I think it's fairly self-evident. John Scales, actually one of Emil's friends from the States. Poor to no discipline, independent service not supervised by headquarters. So basically you're given a task and off you go, but really didn't do what you're supposed to do. Inept officers, serving in an area where members of the units have grudges against the population. I thought that was quite good as well. So can't think of anything off the top of my head. But over here where I live in Margate. We don't like people in Ramsgate. So if I was sent over to Ramsgate, I would probably be a bit more hostile to them. Ian Mitchell, who actually also has written a very good book. What did I like about him? I like the last bit of his regiment. The regiment has a bad experience in its first engagement due to poor leadership by senior officers. So basically, if you start out badly in your career as a regiment, you've got to really, really work quite hard in order to get back up. So Ian Thanks for that one. I pretty like that. And Sarah Jennings, I liked all of this, and lack of training, lack of equipment, lack of food, low confidence, lack of teamwork, no sense of belonging, etc. So again, just a cross section of stuff that came out. But the best one was from Paul White. Okay, and Paul sent me a most wonderful at least 20-point lists. And when I started going down, I thought, blimey, I haven't got this, I haven't got that. I think I had about 5 of his 20 points, but it's so good that I'm not going to show it to you. I'm going to put it in Crossfire as a page, because our designer has given me the first draft of the Crossfire, and I'm a couple of pages short. So Paul, I'm going to put that in Crossfire if you don't mind. Well, I don't really care if you don't mind or not, it's going in. So, but it really does show Paul's a serviceman, and it does give a real soldier's view of what could go wrong as we go through. And Paul, I thought you'd appreciate that photo on the right-hand side of an intrepid, very intrepid Union man, slightly wounded. He obviously tried to shoot himself in the hand. Didn't quite work. Okay, let's move on to let's just think about this. A lot of people said casualties. So could this be the worst regiment? The 5th New Hampshire, could they be the worst regiment based on the fact that they lost the most men? They lost 18 officers and 277 men. So I thought to myself, as a starting point, well, they could be. But when you look at them, and I'll just read this, they obviously served in the Eastern Theatre, 1st Division, 2nd Corps. That division was commanded by Richardson, Hancock, Caldwell, Barlow, and Miles. And I think that if you were a regiment under those officers, you're going to be in the thick of it. And it says here, all the losses were incurred entirely in aggressive, hard, stand-up fighting. None of it happened in routs or through blunders. And its losses include 18 officers, and the number were far in excess of the usual proportion. And I would suggest that the men were bravely led. So I'm going to discount the 5th New Hampshire. Okay, so you've had money on that one. Sorry about that. 83rd Pennsylvania. Well, again, this was a 5th Corps regiment, and serving with Morrill, and after that in Griffin's. 2 of its colonels were killed, and a 3rd was badly wounded and crippled for life. Quote here, it was a splendid regiment, well officered and well drilled. It suffered severe loss by percentage as well as in numbers. So losses do not make you a bad regiment. Okay, and then just moving down here, some of our old favorites here. If anybody wants to argue that the 7th Wisconsin and the 6th Wisconsin, members of the Iron Brigade, were bad regiments, well, you can only be happy, ladies and gentlemen, that we're not having a face-to-face meeting, because I'd ask you to step outside and we can deal with it like men, or men and women, okay? Because the Iron Brigade was a wonderful, wonderful institution. So this now leads me to starting to reveal. We're now going to start the muddle bit of the lecture. So, East or West? Well, it was the West. The time period that this regiment earned its plaudits was between October and February '63. Well, just slightly a wider scale than that. So what's the situation here in the West in October 63. Well, sorry, I just turned the page I shouldn't have done. Okay, so the situation here was that Grant was operating fairly independent command. Halleck was there somewhere in the background, wasn't quite sure what his role was as we were going through. So I'll just show you, this is the sort of overall grand strategy of what was going on. Grant was eventually given command of the area, and he, over the time period, he had set out on a number of advances to try and capture Vicksburg, which is down, of course, in the middle of the screen there. So we've got all these various campaigns, as you can see. We are going to be talking mainly about the upper right, where Grant's Mississippi advance from November through to December. We've got all sorts of things happening in the middle here. We've got the Yazoo Pass expedition, February to April. We know that Sherman got all the way down here, just outside Vicksburg, on December the 27th, 29th. That was, he's obviously got through the passes, sorry, the rivers. We know what the territory is like here. We know that Grant went west of the Mississippi in order to bypass Vicksburg in the end. But we're really just trying to work out what's going on here. We all know the terrain, we all know the area. It's very unpleasant, very hilly, very boggy, very marshy, rivers everywhere, trees everywhere, few towns in between everything that's going on. So into this maelstrom comes our regiment. And our regiment, well, this is how I found this. This is the starting point. This is from the New York Times. I subscribe to Newspapers Inc., and I was probably researching something. Can't remember the circumstances, but this is a little tiny snippet in the New York Times. A whole regiment court-martialed. The 109th Illinois, having refused to fight on the account of the Emancipation Proclamation, has been placed under arrest and is held subject to trial by court-martial. Now this is December 1862. So I've just moved slightly ahead, but this is what got my interest. Of course, is this, in the context of the Great Orange one, fake news? Well, it is and it isn't. So here, I'm going to take this moment to talk about newspapers. And like most of us, I think, you know, you've heard that some newspapers were democratically based and some were Republican based, and I think we all knew that. And but what struck me is, the more that I looked into it, I hadn't realized how polarized newspapers were. It was either Lincoln the Great Redeemer and Savior, Republican, or Lincoln, you know, the autocratic demagogue who wants complete power for himself, Democrat. And there wasn't really much in between. Most of what I'm going to be taking my information from is from the Jonesboro Gazette, and I'll explain the context of that in a moment. Jonesboro Gazette was established in 1849 in the town of Jonesboro in southern Illinois. I'll show you that in a second. And it was a Democratic-leaning newspaper. And all of this, most of the stuff that I'm quoting from or talking about comes from James Evans, who was the editor, and he joined the 109th as a first lieutenant and an adjutant to the staff. And he is the all of my information comes from him. And when I look at it, when I've dealt with it over the time, again, you know, there's a time lag between somebody writing something and then appearing in the paper, because the papers usually were just once a week, maybe twice a week. Certainly Jonesboro was once a week because it was a small circulation paper, but the Chicago Tribune, Chicago Times could even, you know, they were much more bigger, almost daily circulation. So it was about 2 weeks between an event happening and the news getting into the paper, and there was very little checking. There's no way to check, so basically information was put in without too much checking, as we say. And what happened there was, I'm not going to give much away, but eventually, you know that with the rise of the so-called Copperheads and Southern Democrat-leaning people in the Midwest, and I'm generalizing quite badly, there was a purge. Burnside, another one of my heroes, was around that area in 1863, and he closed the Jonesboro Gazette, but later it was allowed to resume publication. So all was not well in southern Illinois. So let's talk a bit about the 109th. So here we go. The 109th came from southern Illinois, and they were mainly farmers. They were mainly from Union County, as you can see. 64% of the people came from Union County, which is a massively high proportion, and the rest from there around. So 970 men, plus about, I'm going to say 30 because it just makes it nice and round. So about 1,000 men, 30 or so staff members, perhaps a little bit less. The average age was 25, mainly farming stock. So one thing I didn't know, this area is called Little Egypt. And obviously they want to call it Little Egypt because of Cairo, or Cairo, as is pronounced. It doesn't matter how we pronounce it today. And it was also because it formed a little triangle, which somebody then said looked like a pyramid, and you know, it's sort of stuck. But this area was called Little Egypt. What was the area like? Well, the area was, the main area we're going to talk about is Jonesboro here, and the town of Anna next to it. And as you can see here on this slide, the left-hand side is now the Trail of Tears State Forest. So I can say, and here's the picture that I took off the internet of it. So you can say that it's typical of most, typical of Kentucky, Tennessee, West Virginia. You've got mountains and hills. It is a geography all of its own in that particular area. There are you know, lakes and rivers. Okay, so when you think of Illinois generally, you do think of it as a flat state with lots of farming. This is a much sort of different area. So these people have got their own sort of different lifestyle to the people in to the north of them. They are Southern with a small s leaning. They are Democrats, and on the whole, they did more trade and business as farmers and businessmen with people from the South. So September 1862, this is not the first flush of recruitment. Okay, these people did not join up when you know, Lincoln demanded or asked for, you know, these hundreds of thousands of men. So why didn't they join up? Well, there was no incentive to. They, you know, they just wanted to do what they wanted to do. As I said, they were Democrats. They didn't want to fight Lincoln's war necessarily. Again, I'm generalizing quite a lot here. They didn't want to fight Lincoln's war. They wanted to just be farmers. They didn't want to hurt their southern friends. They had a very low opinion of the Negro. They were on the whole abolitionists. Sorry, they weren't abolitionists. I do beg your pardon. Because they thought that as soon as the slaves would be free, they would come over the border and take their jobs on the farms, you know, for 10 cents less than they were getting paid, type thing. But nevertheless, of course, the other reason was the draft was coming. So that was an incentive that, of course, if you were drafted, you didn't get a bounty. So suddenly there was this flurry of, well, we're going to be drafted, we might as well join for 3 years and basically see what happens. So 10 companies were organized. Alexander Nimmo of Jonesboro was elected colonel, and Elijah Willard was lieutenant colonel. They, like most of the officers, they were local people. They were businessmen. They were respected in the area, and they had zero experience, or very little. There were some officers, I wish we show you later, there were some officers that had experience in the Civil War, in the Spanish-American War. They were nicknamed Phillips Invincibles in honor of David Phillips, the U.S. Marshal. Phillips was a respected man in the county, and they thought it great to name after him. And Jones in the Gazette said, "I have no hesitancy in predicting that the regiment will do honor to its name and prove itself one of the most useful in Uncle Sam's service." Okay, so just to reiterate what sort of men they were: Democrats, young, on the whole, not that enthusiastic, and Southern looking. Just to put this in complete context, by the 19th of December, the Chicago Tribune said, "I recollect of hearing reports that when this regiment left Jonesboro to join the army, that many of the men cheered for Jeff Davis and the Southern Confederacy as the cars moved off. The feeling of disgust and contempt among the loyal regiments is intense, and if the soldiers were allowed to hold a court-martial on these recreants, not miscreants, but recreants, and found guilty of these charges, they would order out every 10th man to be shot and send the others to the penitentiary during the continuance of the war." Well, this is utter tosh. As far as I found out, they weren't doing that. But this is the sort of thing that was happening at the time. And it is basically a polarized Democrat/Republican problem, as we have seen in modern times as well, ladies and gentlemen. Unfortunately, one member of the regiment didn't make the muster in. On September the 27th, 1862, Andrew J. Andy Bailey of Company D borrowed a pistol from a boy in camp and said he intended to shoot chickens. He went home and told his wife, Laura E. Bailey, he was going to kill her and then himself. She ran from the room, but he shot himself in front of his 10-year-old daughter, Martha. Quite a sad story to start, and sort of, nobody mentions it, but sort of the portent of things to come. Okay, so on the 29th of September, so they all mustered in. They all started to get together in August. A little bit of training, and they were then marching in. They got their marching orders along with all these other regiments you can see on the left-hand side, and they were initially under the guidance of General Brayman, who was organizing things around Cairo, the Cairo area, on behalf of the Union side. I don't have many pictures, I'm afraid, of the officers, so this is just one. I like Brayman, and in fact, not or sort of a family resemblance, maybe, who knows. Okay. So what happens to the regiment, or indeed what happens to a regiment as it goes through? So first of all, on the left-hand side, this is General Quinby. He was in charge of part of the Western Tennessee region where the regiment ends up. So just take it through. So September the 11th, they were mustered in. They got their marching orders. They then started to move south. They were ordered to Cairo and then to Columbus, Kentucky for guard duty. They got their first pay in 5 weeks. So again, money comes into this. Their first pay was only for the first 5 weeks. That's not too bad, I suppose. The regiment leaves Columbus, leaves for Columbus, Tennessee. Leaves Columbus, Ohio for Tennessee, and they arrive in Moscow, Do Svidaniya, and we can see where that is. So let's just look and see where the 109th were operating. So I'm just going to move the screen out of the way slightly. So they're moving south by whatever means they can, rail if they can make it, get a rail connection, but there was also a lot of marching as well. So they end up in Moscow here in the middle on November the 23rd. They are in Holly Springs, December the 20th. I want you to remember that for later, please. January the 14th, they're at Grand Junction. Oops. January 14th, they're at Grand Junction. And February, March, they are in Memphis. I'm not going to give too much away as to how and why, but this is the sort of area that we're going. So from Memphis to Grand Junction, it's 60 miles approximately. From Grand Junction to Holly Springs, it's probably 27 to 30 miles. As you'll appreciate, these are rubbish roads. There's very little rail connection. It's obviously the winter of 1862-63, so it's not the best place to be. I think it's not the best place to be. I wouldn't want to be there in this grand scheme of things. So here we go. Now, people that know me will know of my finance background, so I'm a bit of a numbers man, and you know, give me a spreadsheet and it'll keep me quiet for quite a few days. So there are some tables in here for reference. I just want to put this idea in your head: deaths, discharges, and desertions. So we've got a few people dying in September. We've got a few people dying in October. A few desertions, nothing too exciting. A few people dying in November. 21 desertions in November. Okay, again. Okay, so it's just starting to creep up. Then you've got a total of 43, total of 44, total of 58, a total of 61, all the way through. On their own, you might think that they're not too much, but if you total them down, the other side, you've got about 120 died. You've got about 100 deserted, and discharged means discharged through sickness. So you can see in January and February and March, the sickness rate. This is people that cannot return to duty, and I go on to talk about that quite a bit in a moment. So pick the pace up, Greg. Okay, so here we go. Weapons. So a lot of people said to me, well, weapons are a major reason. So here we go. When they first mustered in, they had, I was going to say they had the old style rifles. Well, what they were actually equipped with was they captured some Confederate rifles, and they were actually kitted out with these. And the rifles were completely useless, and Jones wrote that rocks would be just as serviceable. So they marched down to to Tennessee, and when they're in Moscow, Quimby telephones Rawlings, who's Grant C&C, and says the regiment's badly off arms, 4 different patterns without bayonets and locks so weak that they would explode without a cap. So they're hardly going to throw the 109th into a battle because they've got nothing to fight with. Quimby again says, you know, they've got miserable arms and the whole regiment should be rearmed. Now, if you think about it, they're in a war zone. They're not actually on the front line, if you can identify where the front line is. But at the time of the Van Dorn raid on December the 20th, they still had the same guns. And it wasn't until January the 31st that some first-class Austrian rifles were issued. So they were at a disadvantage. And you could say, well, that's what makes a regiment bad. So well done, Greg. Thanks for telling me that. That's the reason. Well, no, it's not, is it? Because a lot of regiments have bad weapons. Okay. Was it the weather and the countryside? What I've sort of said already, a little bit about West Tennessee. I apologize to anybody that knows West Tennessee. It's lovely most of the time, but in the winter of 1862-63, it was the Mississippi was flooded, high water, heavy rains. Jones wrote that it was a cold rain started at Christmas and lasted until April, and it was bleak. Every Union regiment that went through the area ransacked every single house that was there. It was not a pleasant place to be. Okay, so that's fine. Weather and the countryside, it has got its part to play, but hundreds of regiments or tens of regiments went through the area. Okay, so let's talk about money. So again, just mentioned money at the start, just to clarify what my thought processes were here. They were to be paid $160 on joining up, but they didn't get that, of course, all at the same time. There were no bounty jumpers. There was only 3 desertions in October, and they were not related to the money. They got paid in October, which I said earlier. They then got $16 in February, which is a long time. There was a mutiny at Memphis, again, except for Company K. Company K throughout this are quite exemplary. They were asked to move to Helena. Grant's army was on the move, and they were asked to move to Helena, Arkansas. And they basically said, no, we're not going to because we haven't got paid. So they stacked their arms, and another regiment was called in. They mounted bayonets, and they went, okay, we'll go on the ship, but we still want like to be paid. In April, they were paid up to March. March the 1st. All the privates got $52, so a veritable fortune. Okay, a veritable fortune. Okay, but again, just to emphasize, yes, money was a problem, but it was a problem for every single regiment. So again, I'm building a case for it, but it's just one little thing that went through. Now, sickness. Okay, sickness did have a major problem. Or this regiment had a major problem with sickness, and just want to spend a few minutes on this. So Bolivar was one of the hospitals that I could get a lot of information about. Let me just move on to here. Bolivar is almost due east of Memphis, but on the previous map I showed you, it was just a little bit further off. In fact, here in this particular one, Bolivar is up to the right here. So let's go back. So this is from the Chicago Tribune of December 1862. So Bolivar Hospital, there's actually 3 or 4 sites in the town. It's quite a small town, but as you can see, some lovely buildings in there at the time. And the structure was, shall I say, fairly loose. It was under charge of Dr. Stockloff, 43rd of Illinois. He was in charge. The 109th, on November the 3rd, there were 73 were sick enough to go to hospital. Remember, this is out of, you can say out of 1,000 men, 73 were sick enough to go to hospital, 204 were unfit for duty. So 280 men out of 1,000. So nearly 30%, 28% were unfit. December the 9th, 105 men were in the hospital and 200 were excused from duty. This is the day before Van Dorn's raid. So when we go on to talk about Van Dorn's raid, the hospital, you have to bear in mind that all the companies were reduced from their normal roster. 80 cases were of a chronic nature and should disqualify the parties for service. So these are the people who would eventually either, I'm sorry to say, die, or they would be disqualified, be discharged. Let me just tell you the one story. One soldier of the 109th even died of something called delirium tremens. It was reported that it wasn't induced by the indulgence of liquor. I like this story because it involves drink. Okay? It was not induced by an indulgence of liquor, but from the scarcity of it. He had been accustomed to strong drink all his whole life, and being deprived of it during his connection in the army resulted in the above state. He exhibited first symptoms about 8 o'clock on Wednesday and died a most intense suffering of 5 hours. So, poor chap. Okay. Here are some of the, here's some of the listed illnesses and the information I've been able to look at. I've spent a lot of time looking at this. I've highlighted some key dates, and these are I'm just going to skip through this. It's just to highlight some key dates from the Jonesboro Gazette. Here's the numbers I just mentioned here in the middle here. In January, 350 were in good health out of 700, so it implies 350 weren't. And then in February, Valentine's Day, 230 on the sick list, 220 for fit for duty. And this is quite the telling one. 21st of February, 100 men were declared fit for duty out of 600. So 1/6 of 600 were fit for duty. Don't question me about the difference between 970 and 600. I'm only going by the information I have. But there was a tremendous amount of attrition up to that point. So here's an extract from the newspaper, and what they used to do was obviously casualty lists. Well, here is a sick list, and Jones used to write in and say, as far as I can tell from the information I have, here are the names of people who are sick. And of course, sick and died, and people have died. And what's wrong with them? Obviously, this was for the people back home, their relatives back home, to tell them what their relatives were doing. It's not as clear. I've tried to go through this in some detail. You know, these cold January, February nights that I've had down here. Oh, by the way, my carer is out this afternoon, so I'm completely unsupervised, which is good. So the sick list is there. I just went through it, and I know Charles Rees isn't with us today. I was going to ask Charles if he could explain what some of these things were. Ascites, conchophalmia would be quite interesting. Fifth stick, okay, I'm not sure what that is, but you can see these are the sort of things that people came up with. And every letter that I've read, everything that I've seen, there is always, and so-and-so has got diarrhea, so-and-so has got fever, so-and-so has got the mumps, so-and-so has got pneumonia and is not expected to last a week. Okay. So, but again, just going to throw this to you. That's fine. But you'll say to me, Greg, come on, can you get to the point? This is not unique to the 109th. Every regiment got sick. Okay? And I say, you're absolutely right, folks. Okay. So let's have a look at the breakdown by companies. Okay, so I'm just moving the screen around for myself so I can see a bit better. What was it like by companies, or how did we, how do the numbers look? Well, again, I'm just picking up information. Little bits are contradictory. I don't really mind that at all, but you can see that by company, company F was particularly poor, 50 men, 45, 51 men. Remember, there's 100 men in the company, so 50% of company F, deserted, died, or discharged. And please remember, ladies and gentlemen, this regiment has not fought a single battle yet. So all these people that died are, in essence, from sickness. And the discharge figures will be people that were sick as well. So the desertion. So again, just to highlight, Company K, which was the best company in the group, and we'll see later on that sorry, I'll skip that bit. They're very, very good. They're a very good company, very well managed by their officers, and 1 deserted and 12 died through sickness. Okay, and I put 33%, roughly 33%. Excuse me, roughly 33% of the men deserted, died, or were discharged. So it's quite high. But is it as high as any others? Well, there will be regiments who are comparisons. So again, come on, Greg, get a grip. It wasn't just the privates who deserted. These 2 men, Jarvis Dougherty, William Floor, deserted on March the 25th, March the 9th. They were, sorry, I thought I knew which company they were. I thought I knew. And Corporal John Johnson deserted on October the 26th. So I can tie up who did what when. Okay, I'm going to quickly click through that because I don't want you to see some of the detail. I do have a lot of stuff on deserters. I'm not going to tell you much more, but people say, well, all these people deserted, where did they get to? Well, most of them found their way back to Little Egypt. And because the population was on the whole sympathetic to them, most of them were in open sight. And when Marshal Phillips came along, as was his wont, they hid the people, or indeed he looked the other way. But I would just also say that this area, the Trail of Tears, it wasn't the Trail of Tears, there obviously it was just forest. There are numerous, the story is there are numerous caves and hiding places where some of the deserters went to, and they were supplied on a regular basis from the people in the towns and villages. Okay. Hardly any of the deserters suffered as a result of their desertion. So, where does it turn? Where does this whole thing turn? What makes the 109th bad? How did they suddenly, become court-martialed? Well, it's to do with Holly Springs. So first of all, Holly Springs, it was, when they visited it, it was a fine town, the best I've seen in Mississippi. Well, they hadn't seen many towns in Mississippi, to be perfectly honest. But at the time, it was, what shall we say, a checkerboard type town. Nice streets, nicely laid out, model town. But as we know, it was a tempting target. Tempting target by whom? Well, Van Dorn is the answer. So, very quickly, I'm not going to talk too much about Holly Springs. I can go on to that. I've got some various quotes I'd like to say, but I'm just going to, conscious of the time, so I'm going to move through. So the first is this. So if you remember from the first map, Grant is moving south. Oops. Come on, Greg. Previous. Come on. There we go. Grant's moving south from Holly Springs. All of his supplies are coming from Memphis, down the railway lines. They're coming from Memphis by river, along the railway lines, and coming down this way on the railway lines. He's pretty much tied to the railway and the roads there, and that's his strategy at the time. Grant's moving south. 40,000 troops were at Oxford, which is a little bit further down here. And he's just making his way south, trying to see if he can get to Vicksburg. He's not undertaking a general movement to get to Vicksburg by any particular time. He's just trying out the, just feeling his way. 40,000 troops at Oxford. Just as an interest, Grant issued his Jews general order on December the 19th, so he's a very, very busy man. He's got a lot of things on his mind. And at Holly Springs, as you know, is his big supply depot, and he's got Colonel I think it's Robert Murphy of the 8th Wisconsin Volunteers. They're in charge. They're in charge of defending the area. So, yes, sorry, let me just, so on December the 12th, he dispatched Sherman to Memphis to undertake an approach via Chickasaw Bayou. He stopped at Oxford, and Washington intervened and told him to split his army into 4 corps, one of them to be commanded by McClellan, who Grant didn't hold much favor for. So just a general thing about replacements, unlike the East, I think, because the East was a fairly tight area of campaign. The West is obviously much bigger. If you were a new regiment in the West, you ended up going through a small baptism of marching, guarding, marching and guarding, guarding and marching, until you were deemed good enough to come into what I would call the main fighting force. A Wisconsin recruit said, "I'm very contended with my lot, not contented, I'm contended with my lot, for I know that I'm doing my duty. If I live to get back, I shall be proud of the freedom I shall have and know that I helped to gain that freedom." New regiments that joined didn't fare too well. The 124th Illinois had a hard time learning the drills, but unlike the 109th, they had new arms and equipment. That wasn't until the veterans intervened. One night, the veterans organized a raid and stole the tents and equipment of the 124th Illinois. A few days later, the 124th went on a foraging mission, and they were intervened by one of the veteran regiments. They were intercepted by one of the veteran regiments, who held a court-martial for them breaking foraging rules, found them guilty, and confiscated all their chickens and sheep and butter, and they fined them as well. So, you know, a new regiment didn't fare that great in there. So, what was the 109th? Sorry, let's just see. So, I put here December the 20th. Holly Springs was a disaster for Grant. Well, it was. As you know, Van Dorn entered the town very early in the morning, about 7 o'clock, caught the defenders literally sleeping, and spent the next 8 hours destroying as much as possible, capturing as many people as possible, and basically making a nuisance of themselves. Causing $1.5 million worth of damage? Well, I don't know. Grant was cut off from his information, from his supply lines for a week, and the rations and forage were disrupted for about 2 weeks. But most importantly, the Confederates is that Grant stopped. He stopped and said, I can't do anything until my infrastructure is repaired. But he didn't like what happened. He wanted to blame somebody. He was basically having a bad day, and they were looking for scapegoats. And here's where the poor 109th came into effect. So just before I move on, I put but later a blessing for Grant. I think everyone of you will know that in order to capture Vicksburg, and in order for Sherman to conduct his march to the sea, they basically cut off their supply lines, not completely, but they basically cut off their supply lines and lived off the country in terms of foraging and food. So a lot of people think that Holly Springs made Grant realize that that he could live off the country for a limited time. So 109th. So what were the 109th doing? Well, here's Holly Springs, and Van Dorn was basically coming up the road from 22, Mark 22, Route 22, or Route 22, and the 109th were down here at Waterford, which is 8 miles away. Now, some of the men, about 30 of them, were in Holly Springs. As I said earlier, a lot of them were all over the place in hospitals. So it was a pretty weak 109th down in Waterford. They were guarding some bridges, and they had their old guns, and they were cold, and they were miserable, and they were feeling sorry for themselves. I'm pretty sure that they had no orders. Their orders were to guard the bridges. So when the raid happened, you basically had 2 choices. You either leave where you are, what you're guarding, and rush up to where the gunfire is, if you like, or you stay where you are and wait for orders. So the 109th basically damned if they do, damned if they don't, because if they went north, they didn't know what they were going to. They could have been captured, etc., etc. So they stayed where they were, and obviously when the dust cleared, Grant found out about it, didn't like what he heard, and he sent Rawlings to investigate. Okay, so just move on. I'll leave it that slide. I'll just talk about this. So what happened was this. There's a whole series of back orders, backstories as well. I would also add at this point that their lieutenant colonel was not there. The lieutenant colonel Willard was a few days earlier. He was riding from Holly Springs down to Waterford, and at a place called Lumpkin's Mill. Oh, it says it needed 2 slides. I'm going to hold that story for a minute. Okay, I'm just going to hold that story. Okay. So Grant was looking for a scapegoat. Rawlings came in, had a quick investigation, and decided that that someone had to pay in order to get the army focused on the job. So Rawlings issued Special Orders number 58. Okay, just a second. So I just want to talk about the officers for 2 seconds before I move on to 58. So we've been ticking through the list, and really I've left officers to the end. The officers didn't have much experience. Only Colonel Nimmo, Captain Boren, Captain Hunsaker, and Lieutenant Barringer had experience in the Mexican War. All the officers were elected. some of them got ill, some of them resigned, and I'm now coming to the story of Lieutenant Colonel Willard. Did he fall or was he pushed? So Rawlings investigated the regiment, and they basically said, we think that you have been disloyal. We think you've been colluding with the citizens, the Confederates, in the area. We think that you, we've heard stories that you want to surrender. We've heard a lot of unrest. We're going to confine you to camp. You're arrested. Okay? All except Company K. Company K, being in honourable contrast with the balance of the regiment, is exempt from the effect of the above order and will be placed on duty within the brigade. He issues a special order number 2 on January the 2nd, setting up a court of inquiry. So effectively, they've been arrested. And here is Rawlings' order going through. And these are the what am I going to say? Sorry, these are the claims that they have that they have done. So let me talk about Lieutenant Willard, because he's at the top of the list. Earlier in December, Willard was coming from Holly Springs down to Waterford in the evening, and of course, being a dark December night, he lost his way. He took the wrong fork in the road, and he was captured by some Confederate irregulars. Of course, some people say that he gave himself up. He deserted and gave himself up to the enemy. But then some of the stories were that he was taken prisoner. So it shed a light. The light wasn't very good in terms of Willard. Here's some of the accusations. Captain Ritchie encourages men to desert. Mr. Boswell encouraging his men that they might be captured. Encourages men to desert that they might be captured and parole. John McIntosh decided that he wouldn't fight. So basically, oops, excuse me, let's go back a page. McIntosh said that you know, on the day of the attack, we're not going to go there. Captain Penninger was making plans to surrender his company to the enemy. Lieutenant Stokes straggled from his command, and actually, the story of Lieutenant Stokes is quite interesting. Again, I don't want to take too much time, but he contacted some local farmers and said, I will surrender my men if you give us paroles. And so it's basically some sort of illegal parole thing going on there. So he just wanted to get out of it and go away. And here we are, Lieutenant Evans from the Jonesboro Gazette. He was inciting dissatisfaction of his men and speaking in the proper manner of the war and the president. So basically calling the president nasty names. So very serious. And this is where the original article, the original story that appeared in the New York Times. But were the stories true? Well, yes and no. Partially, some of them were, some of them weren't. The news traveled north very quickly. Sorry, finger press there. Oh, we're almost done, by the way. Okay, so news traveled quickly. The Chicago Tribune on the 12th of January reported, of course, remember the time lag in reporting, those of us who are familiar with the organization of the regiment and the fact that nearly every man is an avowed member of the Knights of the Golden Circle, brackets, except Company K, are not surprised at this disgraceful denouement. Okay. On the 13th, they went further. they are said to be principally from the Wang Doodles or KGCs, one of the schemes of which is to not fire on their southern brethren. Okay, so the term Wang Doodles came in. There are stories of fraternizing with locals, returning contrabands. Feelers put out the regiment were willing to be captured and paroled to get out the war. Okay, so all this evidence was coming in. Rawlins was obviously busy. Grant was on his back all the time. So what happened was the court reported on January the 14th, and a week later, the 109th Regiment was released from arrest and completely exonerated from all suspicions of charges of disloyalty, except for the officers. So on January the 20th, the regiment is at Grand Junction, which is on the west of the map. Sorry, on the right-hand side of the map, and they're ordered to Memphis. Effectively, they're saying, "You're naughty. We still think you're naughty boys. You're going to go to Memphis until we can sort out what we're going to do with you." They have no transportation, so they start walking, marching, walking, whatever. They eventually get some railway cards by the 22nd. And Rawlins issues some further orders against the officers. So sadly, I haven't been to Memphis. I wish I had, because I would love to know how much of Fort Pickering is left. But here's a section of it, and you can see it's obviously it's turned on its side slightly, so it's at the southern edge of the town. I don't think Memphis was a massively big town at that time. But again, it was set out in the familiar checkerboard patterns. Very, very heavily fortified, and Fort Pickering, again, here is a much more detailed map of it. And these little squiggles are obviously encampments of various regiments. So let me just read one letter. So the quartermaster of the 89th Indiana Regiment was stationed at the fort. He wrote, "Our regiment, the 89th, health is improving and the weather is turning warmer. All is quiet here, and I haven't heard a word said about a rebel being near the fort for the last 4 weeks. All the talk is of Vicksburg and peace, and interestingly, a war in Indiana for some reason." Okay, there are several Illinois regiments here, and they are dying very fast. The 109th Illinois Regiment, the one that disgraced the state of Illinois, that laid down their arms, are here inside the fort, and their men are dying from 1 to 3 and 4 a day. While I'm writing, I hear the firing of guns, which is over the remains of one of their men. It looks like a great piece of nonsense, but is practiced by a great many of the soldiers here. Actually, as an aside, that made me, when I was looking at the notes yesterday, I've written down, when was this adopted? When was firing guns over the deceased adopted? So if anybody knows that, I'd be grateful to know. So in Independent View, they've gone to Memphis and they're still dying, and this is February going through. So what happens next to the regiment? Well, they've basically been put in quarantine. They're dying. They haven't seen any action. They haven't got any officers. They're down to about 300, 400 men. So they need sorting out. Grant, in the meantime, it's the campaign season. So Grant, in the meantime, has decided to move everybody south. The regiment moves with them. And when they get down to Lake Providence, Louisiana, which is obviously it's a bit further down opposite, sorry, it's a bit further north of Vicksburg, if I'm remembering the map. Orders were given that the 109th Regiment were going to be disbanded, and the remaining men were going to be incorporated into the 11th Illinois. The 11th Illinois obviously had, by virtue of its number, had been in the fight very early on. They needed replacements, and they decided to transfer the soldiers to the 11th Illinois. They're under April the 10th. Brigadier General Lorenzo Thomas issued special orders number 6, discharging the officers of the 109th and transferred the men to the 11th Illinois. And the last slide, I believe, that I've got there has, oops, just got my slides model, has got the number of men that were transferred to these companies. And if you imagine that this figure, the starting figure was 100, more or less, in this column, you can see that they were heavily attrited throughout this point. And poor old Company K, who entered Fort Pickering in reasonable shape, suffered quite badly through illness in there. So only 63 of the Company K men were left. So you got the originally mustered on the left hand side, and that the attrition rate is there on the right hand side. I think that's actually the surviving rate. So that's the number. The percentage is the number of people that have survived going into the 11th Illinois. After that, the 11th Illinois, so you might have thought, well, was it the officers? Yes. Was it the men? No, because they went on to fight, and they fought extremely well. They were obviously in all of these campaigns here: Fort Gibson, Raymond, Champions Hill, Siege of Vicksburg. So they were in the midst of it. I think that the men of the 109th Illinois redeemed themselves tremendously, having got rid of all that rubbish officer material that they had. So, in conclusion, I would like to say this: those of you that are still with me, thank you. Everything that could have gone wrong for this regiment went wrong. But they were not unique. Other regiments suffered the same. I think the turning point was threefold. It was the officers, their lack of discipline, and the sickness. And even though I haven't mentioned it, they were never really engaged in combat, so they couldn't prove that they were worthy. And this is something that I come back to Paul White's points that I haven't told you that I'm saving for Crossfire. Paul does mention this quite a lot. Seeing the elephant is a phrase that we're all familiar with. So, thank you for your time. That's it for me. I've got enough information for a follow-up, the second worst regiment in the Union Army, which I'm working on. So, I think I'm going to, I don't know what I'm going to do now. Perhaps get it over to Mike. Some people are still with me, I see. Gosh, I've got 32 people still with me. So, Mike, yeah. What do we do now?
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks very much for that, Greg. Yeah, we've had a few people drop out. I'm not sure if that's some technical problems or because they've got other things that they pressing needs. I'm sure it wasn't because of lack of interest in your talk, Greg. So that was really interesting.
That's Fulham. I told you Fulham were playing.
For anybody who's got a question to ask, if you can either use the hands up function, and I can see that you've got a question, or if you want to put something on the chat and put your question on the chat, and then I will unmute you and you can put your question to Greg, and then please remute afterwards so that we're not competing for the audio channel. Can I start though? This is my presidential privilege as always, Greg. What was different about Company K? You mentioned that people said that Company K weren't members of the Knights of the Grand Circle.
Yes.
You sort of skated over things. Did they have better officers? Were they from a different location?
Yeah.
What was different about them that they were exonerated from all of this that was going on?
Yeah, I think that's right. Yes, I've got the composition of all the because I'm a spreadsheet freak, because I said I've got all this. Most of the people in Company K were from Pulaski County. So let's go right back to the front. Right, okay, so they were from this area down here, basically you know, Cairo there. So the majority of the bad boys were from Union County. This one in yellow. Sorry, am I still sharing? Yeah.
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 You still see it.
So, yeah. So they were from there. So the bulk of people were from there. Company K were from, but the majority of them were from Pulaski County. And I will say that the officers that came through were of, you know, they seemed to have a better cohesion with the men. I think they were all kindred spirits, and just perform better. So that's really all I can say on that, Mike.
Yeah, it's quite interesting because we tend to think, I certainly tend to think of Illinois as being really staunchly Union, but this idea that there's this little area down in the bottom, which of course is just opposite Missouri as well, which is famously divided, and you don't really tend to hear about this little bit of Illinois, which has divided loyalties.
It took me by surprise, and because it was also, you know, it was so militarized very early on, and everything went through there. You know, the confluence of those rivers. You just naturally thought that the area was completely committed to the cause, and it wasn't. And again, just something that crops up, and I thought, wow, you know, you just don't know. Okay, you just don't know. Shall I read through the chat and see if there's anything there?
Yeah. I was going to say we've got a couple of things coming in on the chat. If you've got access to it, then you can read them, or you can ask people to comment.
Okay, so good. I'm just going through. Just based. I'm right at the beginning. Again, just going through the initial points quite and where people are coming from. Graham says there were more desertions from troops who were fighting nearer to where they live. That's true. That's perfectly true, Graham. Hadn't really considered that. It didn't take them very long to get from Tennessee up to their homes. Oh, one story I should have said was, if I come to the desertion figures here, these desertions, I put an asterisk against March 23. The bulk of those desertions in March 1863 came the day after 3 or 4 wagon loads of family members came down to see their sons. So basically they came down with their wagons, and tales of we're missing you at home, and about 20 people went AWOL overnight. Okay, good. Oh, you're all very kind. Okay, some of you are exceedingly kind. I don't deserve this. Basil went. Sorry, Fulham are 2-0 up and need watching with the sound on. Yeah, okay. Okay. Yeah, again, Graham, thank you. Has this mass court-martial ever been written about before, or is this research all your own? Well, first of all, it's one of those, I suppose there's a lot of silly, there's a lot of Civil War stuff that just keeps cropping up, and you think, God, I didn't know that. Well, what's that all about? I didn't know that. A whole regiment was court-martialed, and I know through reading this that you know, you've got a regiment. One regiment was sent to look after another regiment, that sort of thing, to supervise them, if you like, or there was you know, there was a guard of bayonets, an honor guard of bayoneted soldiers escorting people on barges, you know, going south, that type of thing. But yeah, I haven't come across it before, and I would be quite happy to hear about it from anywhere else. And the other point is, no, it's not my research. I'm going to say it came. I mean, I'm just going to point. Oh, I'm sharing screen. I don't know, just pointing this up. It's the book I got. Letters to the editor of the Jonesboro Gazette. So James Evans's letters have been printed in a format. There's about 80 pages, 70 pages of the stories. A lot of it's contradictory, but it's fascinating. And then I've read a couple of PhDs about it. But there's certainly, Graham, there's not a regimental history of the 109th. I don't think it would be a great seller.
Did Ella Lon mention it at all, Greg?
No, she didn't. And that's one of the reasons why I bought Ellen Lon's book, was because I thought, well, where am I going to get, you know, information about this, and it's not there at all. So, isn't there? Paul White, you're my hero, by the way. You know that, don't you? He said, did many who deserted return to the unit? That I don't know. I think, as you know, some guys disappear overnight, and they get caught quite quickly, because basically, an unescorted Union soldier marching north on his own will cause some interest. So they were rounded up and sent back. Lincoln did issue an amnesty, didn't he, in 1863, but I don't think many came back. So I think I said most of them who deserted, who found their way home, stayed in the caves and in the cellars of their relatives. So I hope that sorts it out. Gary, my friend from the Custer Society, there's a Willie Dixon song called Wang Dang Doodle. Yes. So I'm just reading through. Illinois was far from being staunchly Union, says Dave Bradley. General Logan, who was from that area, had a lot of work to persuade people to fight for the Union. Yes, and we know that there was talk, wasn't there, about those states actually seceding from the Union themselves and setting themselves up because they lost money, didn't they? They all their wheat went south before the war down the Mississippi, and that was cut off. So a lot of people lost money. Good leadership, Eric Bush says. No, Eric, sorry, I didn't come across any good leadership at all, except for Company K. Another comment about, sorry, you can't see these comments, can you, Mike?
I can see any comments unless they're sent to you privately.
Okay, yeah. So I'm just whizzing through. Those,
some people are sharing to everyone, and some people are sending privately. So.
Oh, I see. Oh, yes, to everyone. Yeah, that's right. Okay, yes, I can see that now. Okay, we're still learning, boys and girls. Okay. So, John Logan. Yeah, John Logan's another one of my favorites. I think you need to get involved in the politics now. You need to sort of, sorry, Ian, Thomas. You need to, you need to move away from the battles occasionally, to get a feeling for what was going on. I know Copperheads and stuff isn't exactly a riveting read. I can never pronounce the guy's name beginning with V, Valdering and Dingingham. But there was a real problem in there. Good. Sorry. Yeah. What happened to the officers? What happened to the officers? Well, that's interesting. Yes. Very quickly, the officers basically they said, right, you're discharged. You're no longer soldiers. You're in a war zone, Memphis, wherever it was, Grand Junction. You've got to get yourself north. Off you go. And basically, they hitched lifts. They walked. They hitched lifts. They went up by river, back to southern Illinois, and that was it. Some lived, of course, they were businessmen, so some went straight back to their businesses. I've got stories of some stories of how they finished their lives out. For example, James Evans, the editor of the newspapers, he was elected county clerk, but isn't quite funny. The governor refused for a time to certify him. So the governor of Illinois refused to allow him to be the clerk of the county because of what he did. But he died at the age of 35. He was running a mercantile business, but he was one of the 10th most richest men in the county. Yeah, some just went on and just lived natural lives, because you would do, I suppose. Because of the nature of the beast, I think you just go back to the area that you came from, and you'll live your life out. And if you didn't want to go to that shop to buy stuff, you go to another shop, I suppose. Okay. Okay, so yeah, I think that's.
I think that's
gone
about it.
through.
We've lost a few people to Fulham, but
Yeah. Okay. I do apologise. I do apologise to those who I haven't given you your questions, but I do appreciate people coming and listening to what I've had to say. And as ever, if you've got anything you want to add, you can contact me through the normal channels.